I think what I wanted to talk to you about is rhetoric to reality, this kind of concept of how do we actually make a green recovery in the world that we're in a reality. So I just wanted to touch on a few things that we're seeing in terms of the trends in the UK, in terms of what people are thinking and how people are feeling about the position we're in. So obviously the COVID crisis has been a really horrific way of bringing communities together, but that is what it has done. I think we've seen far more people take a step back and really start to think about what do we mean about our economy, what do we want for our lives, and have reflective time that probably none of us have had for years. I think the recent survey, so there was a survey probably about 2 or 3 months ago by the RSA, which asked people what did they want post-COVID. And that came out very strongly. I don't know whether you've already talked about it, Alicia, with the concept of stronger community, people really wanting much stronger communities, better air quality, so less air pollution, and more wildlife. And what's really interesting about those are all things that are completely within our grasp, but that we've slightly forgotten about. And of course, they're part of the commons rather than part of the economy, which also means that they tend to be very forgotten when government policy gets involved. And so that really heartened me in terms of that voice coming through. And I think more recently, there was another poll a couple of weeks ago, which really came out with only 6% of people want to go back to a pre-COVID world. So I think there is a general feeling amongst society that we don't really need to go back to where we were. I guess on the other side of this is what is concerning to me. So I dialed into a podcast on the world economy last night, which was had Alistair Darling and Stephanie Flanders and another American economist, Joe Figler, I think his name was. And it did slightly depress me because I put the question to them, is this an opportunity for a green recovery, a green economy? Because if you look back to 2008, post the banking crisis, when we recovered out of that, and I think Alistair Darling was in charge at that point, when we recovered out of that, essentially we went backwards on climate emissions and pollution. So we produced more climate emissions and more pollution as a result of coming out of the 2008. So we seem to have built back worse rather than build back better at that point. And so I said, is this an opportunity to do something different? And when you listen to economists, they're so panicking that the economy that they understand and know, and the operations and the way business works that they understand and know, will collapse. That they can't really contemplate trying to restructure it in this process. And I personally think this is a real disappointment, and something that I think we kind of need to try and figure out whether the people in charge really, I mean, generally most politicians, I don't think personally really know what they're doing. I mean, if you look at a lot of the announcements about bringing schools back and blah, 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 I mean, there is some semblance of knowledge, but most of it isn't. And I think a lot of the recovery process is driven from fear and not understanding what the real potential and possibility is. And I think this is time for us to do a role where we stand up and tell them what we want and tell them very clearly why it will work. Because if we don't do that and we rely on them to just try and make it up as they go along, that's exactly what they will do. And they will also, this kind of panicked feeling that I got from Alistair Darling when he answered my question last night was, we just can't afford for it to fail. So we've got to do whatever we can straight away. And that means we're going to carry on subsidizing those businesses that potentially caused us this problem in the first place. And so after listening to last night, we're doing a lot of work as Good Energy to sign up, support the creative industry to come back better, support sort of general industry, work with lots of the UN Sustainability Development Agency in the UK, etc. And we've signed lots of letters and written to Boris Johnson a lot about a green recovery, and that's the position we should be in. But we need to, that's not enough. I think all of us need to talk to our MPs, work as organisations to demonstrate why growing back better, 1, will work, and 2, will provide jobs, and 3, will make sure that we don't get into this position again. And what I'm going to do this morning is just sort of lay out how I'm thinking about that in my sector, the energy sector, and where I see the institutional biases over the last 10 years have set us on a pathway that I think has partially helped us create the crisis that we're in today. So if I look at the energy sector, essentially there are 4 areas that really impact how the energy sector is being developed and how it works. And the one sector we kind of always forget, and definitely is the energy sector. So if you talk to CEOs of supply companies, the last thing they talk about is research and innovation. It's not really in their heads. They're normally worried about whether the business is going to burst. So the research and innovation tends to be left to the large organizations who've managed to establish themselves effectively with government to take in income and support their businesses through government support. And if you look over the last 10 years, somebody presented me a picture in a meeting I was at. And they probably shouldn't have presented it to me because it gave me a stark insight into where the UK has spent its innovation cash. So I'm just going to turn the buzzer on my phone off. And over the last 10 years, we have spent the majority of our innovation funding in aerospace research. And essentially where that has been spent is probably pretty much with 1 or 2 main players in the UK, most likely to be BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce, on improving the efficiency of manufacturing airplanes. So not all of it is spent in there, but quite a significant portion of it. So what we've done is we've bedded into our economic process organizations who are too big to fail. With all the innovation that's coming through in this country, focused in an industry that promotes global travel, has significant carbon emissions related to it. And you can kind of see where I'm going is that, and as a result of something like a pandemic, when you close down everything, is most susceptible to that. So you can see the desperation with which we're trying to get people back into other countries, to get them back on planes, to get them back going on holiday. That is in the main driven by a sort of underbelly of our economy, which is driven by making more planes. And that 2 of the biggest plane manufacturers, BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce, in terms of systems, are here in the UK. And for me, what's fascinating about that is this is an opportunity not to carry on doing the same thing. And so where we really have to start is making sure that that innovation funding is set up to go to small and medium-sized businesses. It's set up to go to real innovations, not just making more things. I sat on another panel recently when somebody was telling me that during COVID, they'd done this massive innovation step and they were now producing more canned goods than ever before. And I went, that doesn't sound like innovation. That sounds like efficiency. That's what businesses are meant to do anyhow. That's not about innovation. Innovation is about delivering baked beans with no cans. That is innovation. It's about changing a whole system that fundamentally benefits society. So as you can hear, I'm a little bit passionate about the innovation thing that seems to get forgotten. And as a result, all the big players end up taking all the money. So one of the big challenges that I came in when I sit on the board of Innovate UK and a couple of other people who were brought in was really to challenge the status quo of all the money going to a few small numbers of players and actually try and make sure that they were set up to provide innovation funding to lots of smaller businesses and entrepreneurs, because that's what we want. We want to see changes. We want to see different business models. We want to see circular economy. And that is what innovation can do. And that's where, for me, it's not just the energy sector, but all our sectors should be looking. Innovation funding is where it all starts. It's where businesses flourish from. It's where we start our new economy from. So you can hear, if any of you have any innovation businesses, please do go and try and get some funding out of Innovate UK, because this is the time that they should be spending money. And they are beginning to spend money on small businesses, thinking about innovative ideas to deal with big societal problems. So that's my first one about growing back better. My next one is, and this is very specific to the energy industry, but you can look at across the transport industry as well, is that our infrastructure, so whether that's our roads or our gas pipelines or our electricity grid networks, were built in a world which was high carbon. So it was built, so 20 years ago, the energy sector, the electricity sector, was supplied by 37 large power stations, most of which were sort of coal or gas or all these guys. And essentially, big utilities like British Gas would own the power stations, they'd own the wires, and they'd own the customers. In their heads, they'd own the customers. Obviously, we don't believe as consumers we're ever owned. But that's how they saw their lives. And they'd just rely on the fact that customers use more energy year on year. What's happened over the last 10 years is that has been massively disrupted. We have over 1 million people now generating power in their own homes. We have a significant change in terms of the way people demand energy, that is reduction and changing. And we have the opportunity, we now have 47% of our power on average over the last year has been generated from renewable energy. So really big shifts. But that infrastructure was built at a time when the big carbon guys were playing. And actually, what we've now got to see, and this is the really boring things about recovery, is that unfortunately, it's not, I absolutely assure you, going to sit in a room with a bunch of people talking about wires and networks is not like having strawberry jam, unfortunately, because that would make it much more fun. Unfortunately, it's very dull and very dry. And the thing about it is politicians don't like it because it doesn't get them headlines. It's the really boring stuff. But actually, the really boring stuff is sorting out, how do you plug new power stations, small power stations into networks? How do you inject hydrogen or gas, green gas into the gas grid? How do you get people off oil burners in their homes, and if they're not on the gas grid, and put electric heating into their homes? How do you do all those things? And it's hard graft and work, basically. And we need to keep pushing on that. And it's the same with roads. Do we really need to build more roads, or should we build more bike lanes? I think I saw an outline of a recent study that just showed how many more people you can transport on a bicycle in a city than you can in a car. And it's obvious, obviously, but they've done the analysis, and it just shows cities should not be allowing any more traffic into the centre. They should be putting more bike lanes in everywhere. So that is infrastructure. And we have to, if we want to shift economies, we have to think about the infrastructure and how we adapt it for what we want to grow in the future. The next piece in the energy sector is the marketplaces and the generators in that marketplace. And again, the marketplace in the UK energy sector was built in a time when we had lots of large coal and gas power stations. One of the biggest challenges for the energy sector now is that actually power prices fluctuate quite a lot, because renewable energy doesn't have a fuel cost. It has a cost up front that you have to pay for over time, but any extra unit you generate doesn't have an additional cost, which means it really disrupts the marketplace, and the price that you pay for that power is really disrupted. And what we're not seeing is, so for me, the marketplace needs to be able to have access by individuals, households, businesses, to allow, so when we have too much renewables, so on the 24th of May, we produced 69% of our electricity from renewable energy in the UK, which is I think it's a target. I think it's a record. But actually, we'd switched off 1 gigawatt of renewable energy in Scotland because we couldn't get it from Scotland to where the demand was, and there wasn't sufficient demand. And so what you can see is that infrastructure and that marketplace is not saying, okay, during that period, maybe we should have got, if we'd had some battery storage or we'd had electric vehicles on the system, we could have used more of that demand in that period. And these marketplaces are not built to be able to include individuals, businesses, a wider market in this new world where we see a lot of power being produced from clean energy sources, but we're not being able to use. And then finally, my vision is that we as people, we as consumers, we as people who use things are incredibly important in this transformation. So if you look at the Climate Change Committee is the body that was independent body set up by government to advise government on climate change policy. And they're very research based, and they produce this wonderful pie chart which just basically shows how we're going to reach climate zero carbon in the UK by 2050. And what it talks about is at least 60% of those actions are going to include technological and behavioural change mixed together. So that means we, as users of energy, are a really important part of that process. And at the moment, what we're seeing is there is no protection for consumers about the products they buy. So if somebody tells you it's a green electricity product, there's nobody protecting you to make sure it really is a green electricity product. It's up to you to understand the vagaries, and I assure you there are vagaries in our market, of what is green electricity, how is it produced, and how do I know that I've bought some rather than just buying some certificates off somebody else who says that they bought it. And this is something that we think we also need to see, is that government needs to make sure that consumers are protected, that when people are trying to do the right thing by buying a greener product, whether it's from shampoo through to green electricity, that it really is green and it really is making a difference. And they, by switching their behavior, they're going to make a change. And that is something we have not traditionally seen. The regulator has been very focused on price and not on looking after consumer choice around the future green agenda. And that's something we as an organisation are trying to change. So for me, those 4 areas are the key areas to kind of help us set us on a new pathway to a future that could look very different. Unfortunately, today, we are not seeing any changes. So I think there are some green shoots in the innovation sector. There was an innovation budget round for 200 million in innovation in climate change for small businesses. So we're beginning to see a little bit at that end. I did see the gas networks come out with a future strategy around hydrogen and green gas. So that is beginning to shift. The marketplace, not at all yet. And the green consumer, not at all yet. So those are 2 areas we want to shift. What I really think is a missed opportunity here is that state has become an important part of our marketplace. So for a country that has pretended to be a market-led country for 40 years since Maggie Thatcher, one, we are a market-led country. Our regulation absolutely affects the markets we operate in. But 2, we're now spending our way out of this, and we need to hold our politicians to account on how they spend that money. Putting it back into the airspace market is not okay. That shouldn't be where we're spending it. We need to make sure that they spend it in areas that creates green jobs, that supports clean air, and supports a long-term ambition to reduce the climate impact of the planet. So that is my road to recovery. There's quite a lot in there, I know, and there's probably other things you'd much prefer me to talk about, but I hope that's given you kind of an overview of what we're looking at and how we're trying to enact this. We actually have a meeting with the Energy Minister this afternoon to talk about some of this stuff. Unfortunately, I feel rather sad that I don't hold out a huge amount of hope for change, but you never know, it might change. What was really interesting, apparently the French government has bailed out Air France as an airline as part of recovery. And I think we're going to see this continue. But what they've done is they've said to Air France is they have to stop all their localized flights. So at least they've put some sort of carbon restriction on it. Not a perfect one, but at least it's moving in the right direction. And that's the kind of boldness we need to see from governments, is if they're going to bail out these companies, that they need to absolutely put carbon restrictions on them as they do it.